The Nile was never just a river. It was the pulse of a continent, the artery through which Africa gave life to the world. It carried more than water. It carried wisdom, science, culture, and the thaw of human civilization itself. The world often looks at Egypt as a miracle born from the desert, but what they forget is that Egypt was not an isolated wonder. It was Africa's masterpiece, a reflection of the collective genius that flowed through the entire continent. The Nile wasn't Egypt's secret. It was Africa's gift to the world, and the time has come to remember that truth. Long before maps, long before written borders, there was a people who understood the rhythm of the earth. From the heart of Central Africa to the sands of the Mediterranean, the Nile connected tribes, kingdoms, and wisdom. It wasn't just a river that sustained life. It was a road that carried knowledge. It taught the world how to farm, how to build, how to think. It gave birth to geometry through the measuring of its floods, astronomy through the study of its seasons, and philosophy through the understanding of its flow. Every drop of the Nile carried the imagination of Africa, turning barren land into the cradle of civilization. Yet history has a way of distorting truth. It isolated Egypt from Africa, painting it as a mysterious exception rather than an African expression. The greatness of the Nile was not confined to the pyramids. It was spread across the continent through spirit, intellect, and innovation. The same creative force that designed the pyramids inspired the builders of Great Zimbabwe, the scholars of Timbuktu, and the artists of Benin. The Nile was not a divider, it was a connector. It linked nations before borders existed, and people before politics divided them. Its water flowed with unity, showing that Africa's strength has always been in connection, not separation. Every civilization that rose along the Nile carried within it the heartbeat of the continent, the science of irrigation, the architecture of temples, the art of writing. All of it was born from African minds that observed, adapted, and perfected. The Nile gave the world the concept of balance, of Ma'at, the understanding that order, justice, and harmony sustain life just as water sustains the earth. And even though many have tried to take credit for its wonders, the truth remains that the Nile was and will always be Africa's testament to what human potential can achieve when guided by wisdom and unity. When we speak of the Nile, we speak of more than geography. We speak of memory. Every bend in that river carries the story of resilience, invention, and spiritual awakening. Its waters have seen kingdoms rise and fall, yet the spirit of the people who lived by it never faded. They understood something deeper than mere survival. They understood legacy. They built monuments not just of stone but of knowledge, passing down lessons that shaped mathematics, medicine, and morality. And while the world often gives Egypt credit for birthing civilization, it forgets that Egypt was nourished by Africa. The Nile did not flow from Egypt to Africa. It flowed from Africa to Egypt. Civilization too flowed in that direction. Africa has always been the mother of invention, yet too often her children have been taught to see her as a mystery or a tragedy. But the truth is, Africa is the foundation of the world's progress. The Nile stands as proof that Africa gave long before it was ever taken from. Its wisdom crossed oceans, carried by trade, migration, and the endurance of culture. The calendar, the plow, architecture, spirituality, all were born from African observation of nature's patterns. And when you realize that the Nile sustained one of the greatest civilizations in history, you must also recognize that it was sustained by the intelligence and creativity of African minds. Imagine what it means to carry within you the same blood as the people who mastered the rhythm of the Nile, who turned deserts into gardens, who built structures that still defy time. That is the inheritance of Africa. The Nile is not just a reminder of where we came from, it is a challenge to remember who we are. It tells us that greatness is not something given, it is something discovered. The world may have taken from Africa, but it can never take away the source of her power, her ability to create, to nurture, to renew. The Nile also teaches an eternal truth about endurance. Through droughts, floods, and storms, it continues to flow. It adapts, reshapes, and restores itself. Just like Africa, empires came and went, yet the continent remained alive, waiting for its children to remember their roots. The diaspora, scattered across continents, carries the same spirit that once thrived along the Nile's bank. Every invention, every movement, every creative act by people of African descent is the river's memory reawakening. You cannot stop what flows naturally, and you cannot silence the truth that was born in the current of that river. We often measure progress in wealth and power, but the true measure of civilization is wisdom, balance, and creativity, all of which the Nile gave to humanity. Africa's gift was not gold or territory, it was knowledge. The world learned how to live, build, and think from a continent that understood the sacred relationship between humanity and nature. The Nile was a teacher long before there were classrooms. Its course shaped not just land but consciousness. It whispered that all things are connected, that what nourishes one nourishes all. That truth still matters today as we seek unity in a divided world. So when you look at the Nile, don't just see a river, see a mirror. It reflects the greatness of a people whose story began before history was written. It reflects the ingenuity that built the foundation of science, the spirituality that inspired balance, and the perseverance that carried civilizations through time. The Nile's journey from the heart of Africa to the sea is the same journey of the African spirit, from obscurity to illumination, from struggle to triumph. The world must stop treating Africa as the footnote to civilization and start recognizing it as the author. The Nile is evidence that Africa gave before it was ever asked. It gave life to Egypt, wisdom to Greece, and inspiration to the world. And now, as modern Africa rises again, her rivers still speak, telling her children to return, to remember, and to rebuild. The same water that carved the path of ancient glory still flows, waiting to witness a new generation awaken to its purpose. The Nile wasn't Egypt's secret. It was Africa's open hand extended to humanity, offering the knowledge of how to live in balance, how to build with purpose, and how to endure through change. It is the oldest symbol of generosity, the living proof that Africa's heart has always been to give life to others, even when the world forgot her name. The Nile's story is our story, a story of renewal, resilience, and rebirth. Let this truth awaken in every descendant of Africa. You come from the land that taught the world how to think, how to build, how to rise. You are not the aftermath of history, you are its beginning. The Nile flows within you. Its strength is your inheritance. Its journey is your reminder. No matter what the world tried to erase, you are the living continuation of that flow, enduring, powerful, and eternal. And as long as rivers run and hearts remember, Africa's gift to the world will never cease to give. Civilization did not rise from luck or accident. It rose from understanding. The Nile was never simply a river running through the land. It was the greatest teacher the world had ever known. Its waters shaped not only the earth but the mind of humanity. Along its banks, men and women learned how to measure time by the stars, how to grow food from the soil, and how to align their lives with the rhythm of nature itself. The Nile was Africa's first library, a living classroom where every season, every flood, and every breeze carried a lesson. To live by the Nile was to be in constant conversation with wisdom. Its flow taught patience, its floods taught balance, and its constancy taught faith in the natural order of life. Civilization didn't begin by chance, it began by design, with Africa as its architect. From the highlands, where it was born, to the delta where it kissed the sea, the Nile united minds across thousands of miles. People who had never seen each other shared the same dependence on its flow, the same reverence for its power, and the same hunger to understand it. They built their lives not on conquest, but on observation. They measured, they recorded, they planned. They learned that the earth was not to be controlled, but to be respected. The Nile's people saw the world as a system of balance, a cycle that demanded harmony between humanity and nature. That understanding became the seed of science, the birth of philosophy, and the beginning of civilization. Every great empire that rose along its waters did so not through violence, but through knowledge. When the Nile flooded, it destroyed what was weak but renewed what was strong. Its rhythm demanded foresight, organization, and cooperation. Entire communities learned to read its moods like language, to interpret the stars above and the soil below as messages from the universe. That awareness created not only agriculture but architecture, medicine, and mathematics. The precision that built the pyramids came from generations of Africans who had learned to calculate the flood's arrival, the land's fertility, and the season's rhythm. The Nile was a university long before schools existed, a flowing archive of discovery and invention. It is often said that Egypt was a miracle in the desert, but what many forget is that Egypt was Africa's message to the world. The beauty, order, and symmetry of its civilization were not isolated achievements. They were the expression of African genius that had matured along the Nile's path. What others later called progress was already being practiced there. Medicine from herbs, navigation from the stars, and laws grounded in balance and justice. The concept of ma'or, truth, order, and harmony, did not arise in temples. It arose from the river that sustained everything around it. The people learned that life itself depended on maintaining equilibrium, just as the Nile depended on its seasonal rhythm. Every generation added to this design, refining and expanding the blueprint of civilization. The African mind saw the earth not as something to dominate but to understand. The Nile's people saw creation as partnership, not ownership. They worked with nature, not against it. That cooperation birthed innovation, allowing them to predict floods, harvest crops, and build monuments that still defy time. Their wisdom was so deep that even thousands of years later, the principles they lived by continue to guide architecture, astronomy, and philosophy. Their achievements were not spontaneous. They were the result of discipline, study, and a deep relationship with the universe. Civilization began by design because Africa designed it that way. Every structure, every field, every written word that came from that region carried the mark of intention. The people did not stumble upon greatness. They built it step by step, generation after generation. The Nile was their teacher, their witness, their proof that mastery is born from observation and patience. When the world praises ancient wonders, it must remember that those wonders were not born in isolation, but flowed from Africa's design of harmony between humanity and nature. The wisdom that came from that river was the foundation of all that followed. The Greek philosophers, the Roman engineers, the European scholars, all borrowed from what Africa had already created. But the world often forgets this truth, because it challenges the illusion that civilization began elsewhere. It is easier to erase Africa's contribution than to admit that everything began in her soil, under her sun, and through her rivers. Yet the Nile cannot be rewritten. Its waters still flow with memory. Its presence still speaks of a time when human beings understood balance, purpose, and unity. The Nile was the bridge between heaven and earth, between mind and matter, between man and creation. And from that bridge came every form of knowledge that the world now calls its own. Civilization was not the work of chance. It was the expression of divine order translated into human understanding. The people of the Nile did not need to look outside themselves for wisdom. They found it in the cycles of life around them. They mapped the stars not for wonder but for necessity. They built monuments not for pride but for remembrance. They recorded history not for ego but for legacy. Their design was intentional, methodical, and eternal. It was not just about survival, it was about purpose. They knew that to sustain life you must understand life. To build a civilization, you must first build character. The Nile taught them both. The river's lesson still applies today. In a world driven by haste and greed, the Nile's example reminds us that true progress is never accidental. It is designed through patience, unity, and understanding. It shows that greatness is born not from domination but from balance. When humanity learns again to move in harmony with the earth as the Nile's people once did, then civilization will evolve again not through machines, but through wisdom. The Nile continues to whisper that truth, carrying it through time, through generations, and through the hearts of those willing to listen. Civilization didn't begin by chance. It began because Africa listened to the earth, learned from it, and built with it. The Nile was its first architect, its greatest teacher, and its eternal proof. From its flow came the blueprint of life itself. To understand civilization, we must first understand the river that made it possible. And to understand the Nile, we must honor the continent that gave it meaning, Africa, the designer of human destiny. The Nile carried more than water. It carried memory. Its flow was not just the movement of a river, but the passage of time itself. Every drop that touched its banks carried within it the whispers of ancestors who had lived, built, dreamed, and taught along its path. The Nile was a moving archive, a living testimony of Africa's genius. It held the laughter of children playing by its edge, the chants of priests invoking harmony, and the songs of farmers thanking the earth. It remembered every triumph and every trial, every birth and every burial, and it never forgot. Even when history tried to silence Africa's voice, the Nile kept speaking in the language of flow and endurance. To understand the Nile is to understand the persistence of a people who refuse to vanish. It is to understand how knowledge can be carried not in books, but in rhythm, in the pulse of nature itself. The Nile carried wisdom across generations, transferring lessons that shaped not only Egypt, but the entire continent. Its waters connected the south to the north, the interior to the sea, and the past to the present. It was both a lifeline and a messenger, ensuring that Africa's legacy continued even when borders, wars, and lies tried to separate its people. Every tide that reached the Mediterranean carried a story from the heart of Africa, a reminder that the source of life and civilization began deep within the continent. For thousands of years, civilizations rose along its shores, nourished by its generosity and inspired by its mystery. The Nile taught humanity how to farm, how to organize, how to prepare for the future. It taught discipline through its floods and patience through its droughts. Its annual rhythm became the heartbeat of early African timekeeping. The farmers learned when to sow and when to harvest by watching the waters rise and fall. The builders studied its balance to create the geometry that would later shape the pyramids. The healers used its plants and minerals to develop the early foundations of medicine. The Nile was more than a river. It was the world's first university, its lessons written not in ink, but in water. When the world began to forget Africa's role in shaping civilization, the Nile stood as a quiet but powerful witness. It did not argue, it simply continued to flow, undisturbed by the rewriting of history. Empires rose and fell, conquerors came and went, but the river remained the same, feeding the same soil that had birthed knowledge long before foreign scholars arrived. The stones of its banks still bear carvings of African hands that knew mathematics, astronomy, and architecture before those words were spoken in other tongues. Its memory is imprinted not only in the monuments of Egypt, but in the DNA of every descendant of Africa, whose creativity, resilience, and brilliance mirror the timeless endurance of that river. The Nile carried memory because Africa understood that true legacy does not need to be shouted, it only needs to endure. The river did not boast of its importance, it simply existed, and in its existence it transformed the world. It fed empires, inspired philosophies, and gave rise to the first forms of governance and law. The people who lived by it didn't just build with stone, they built with knowledge. They recorded the patterns of the sun and moon, learned to measure time by the stars, and designed calendars that would influence civilizations for centuries. The Nile's movement became a metaphor for life itself, constant, ever-changing, yet eternal. Even in moments when Africa was stripped of its dignity and its history was stolen, the Nile's presence defied amnesia. It was the memory that could not be erased. Its water carried the stories of Nubia, Kush, and Ethiopia, the ancient roots of a greatness that predated empire. It carried the memory of spiritual systems that saw the divine in nature, in balance, and in community. It carried the voices of builders, artists, and philosophers who saw knowledge as a sacred inheritance to be shared, not hoarded. When the world began to label Africa as primitive, the Nile silently laughed because it had seen the truth. It had seen the birth of wisdom in African hands, long before the rest of the world could even dream of civilization. The Nile's memory also lives in its symbolism. It represents continuity, the unbroken chain that links Africa's past, present, and future. Its source, deep in the heart of the continent, is a metaphor for origin. Its long journey northward, cutting through nations and cultures, represents the diaspora, the spread of African essence throughout the world. And its mouth, where it meets the sea, symbolizes return, the idea that everything which begins in Africa eventually finds its way back home. This is why every descendant of Africa, no matter where they live, feels an invisible pull toward the continent. It is the pull of memory carried through blood just as the Nile carries its waters. What the world often sees as a river was, for Africa, a mirror. It reflected not only the sky above but the spirit within the people who depended on it. When they looked into its surface, they saw their ancestors, their future, and their purpose. It reminded them that life is not linear but cyclical, that what you give to the earth returns to you, that what you plant in wisdom blooms in eternity. The Nile carried that message through time, through invasions, through colonization, through the silence of centuries. And even now in the modern age, its current whispers the same truth. Africa remembers. The memory the Nile carried is not confined to the land it nourished. It flows through art, music, and identity. It speaks in the rhythm of the drum, the patterns of traditional cloth, the stories told under moonlight. It is alive in the creativity of Black artists, the strength of Black activists, the genius of African scholars, and the beauty of African women and men who continue to rise despite every attempt to diminish them. The river's lesson remains: greatness is never truly lost. It is only forgotten, and the moment one remembers, it returns in full force. To say that the Nile carried memory is to acknowledge that Africa's wisdom is not ancient history, it is a living force. It flows through generations, shaping new thinkers, inventors, and dreamers. Every Black child born into this world inherits a drop of that memory, a spark of that genius, a rhythm of that flow. It reminds them that their story did not begin with slavery or colonization, but with creation, discovery, and innovation. It tells them that they are not defined by what was taken, but by what still lives within them. The Nile carried more than water. It carried the essence of a continent, the strength of its people, the depth of its wisdom, and the beauty of its resilience. And as long as that river flows, Africa's memory will never fade, because water, like truth, cannot be destroyed. It only changes form, travels, and eventually returns home. The Nile's gift was never just life, it was remembrance. And through that remembrance, the children of Africa continue to rise, unbroken, unstoppable, and eternal. Before the world had kings, Africa had kingdoms that reached beyond imagination, empires that flourished with philosophy, architecture, and order, long before other civilizations even understood what those words meant. Africa didn't wait for the world to show it how to rule, how to build, or how to think. It was already doing all those things while the rest of the world was still learning to walk in the light of its own discoveries. The soil of Africa has always been rich, not only in minerals, but in meaning. Every grain of sand, every gust of wind, and every river flowing through it tells a story that the world has borrowed from but rarely acknowledged. Africa never needed to imitate the world because it was the blueprint from which the world learned. Its rhythm, its systems, its values, and its vision have been echoed across continents, sometimes distorted, sometimes denied, but never erased. The roots of human intelligence, spirituality, and society are buried deep within African soil, and even though time and history tried to cover them, they still breathe through every innovation, every idea, every civilization that followed. The pyramids were not merely structures, they were symbols of cosmic alignment, showing that African architects understood mathematics and astronomy with a precision that modern science still studies. The world calls them mysteries, but to Africa, they were expressions of divine order and harmony with nature. Long before textbooks existed, African thinkers were already decoding the patterns of life, the movement of the stars, and the meaning of balance between humanity and the universe. The Nile was the silent witness to it all, flowing beside temples that celebrated not war but wisdom, not conquest but creation. The priests, scholars, and philosophers who lived by that river didn't look outward for knowledge, they looked within and found it written in the language of the earth. They knew that to master the world one must first understand self, and that understanding became the seed of civilization. The world would later call this enlightenment, but Africa simply called it living in truth. When explorers came centuries later, they believed they were discovering something new. They saw the art, the architecture, the governance, and the people, and thought they had found a land of wonder. What they did not understand was that Africa had already discovered itself thousands of years before. The explorers didn't arrive to teach, they arrived to learn, even if they did not realize. Every continent that came into contact with Africa took something from it, its gold, its knowledge, its music, its stories, but Africa remained unbroken, unshaken, and deeply aware that imitation was unnecessary. The rhythm of its culture echoed across ocean. You can hear it in the heartbeat of the drum, see it in the dance of survival, and feel it in the creativity of its people who continue to shape the world even when the world refuses to give them credit. Africa's philosophy was simple but profound: progress without losing balance. While other civilizations chased power, Africa sought harmony. While others built empires through destruction, Africa built them through understanding. The concept of community, of unity and diversity, of shared responsibility and collective success, were African long before they were adopted elsewhere. The very idea of democracy, people having a voice, found its earliest roots in African councils where elders gathered under trees to discuss the future of the tribe. Justice was not just law but balance, not punishment but restoration. The world borrowed these ideas and reshaped them, but their origin remains African. To remember this is not arrogance, it is truth. Africa did not imitate, it inspired. Every civilization that rose after Africa did so by learning knowingly or unknowingly from its wisdom. The ancient Greeks studied in Egypt. Philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato learned from African priests and scholars. The foundations of Western thought were drawn from the wells of African knowledge. Even the sciences, from medicine to mathematics, have traces of African origin in their DNA. The early physicians of Egypt performed surgeries and understood anatomy centuries before others could define the concept of biology. The builders of Nubia and Kush engineered temples that withstood time itself, teaching the world the principles of geometry and balance. The navigators of the Swahili coast mapped stars and trade winds long before compasses were invented. Africa has always been the teacher, the innovator, and the guide, even when the world tried to rewrite the story. Yet what makes Africa's wisdom truly powerful is not only its innovation but its heart. Africa taught the world not just how to build but why to build. It showed that greatness means nothing if it doesn't serve the people. It showed that wealth without purpose is empty, and that knowledge without compassion leads to ruin. In every African tradition, wisdom is not measured by what you possess, but by what you give back. This truth has echoed across time and continues to shape the essence of humanity itself. Even in modern times, the world's art, fashion, language, and music all bear the fingerprints of Africa's creative soul. Every rhythm that makes you move, every beat that makes your heart race, carries echoes of ancient drums once played to celebrate life. Every melody born from struggle and resilience traces its roots back to the continent that turned pain into poetry and survival into song. Africa's gift to the world was never only material, it was spiritual, intellectual, and emotional. It gave the world rhythm and reason, science and soul, memory and meaning. It gave the world the ability to see beauty in struggle, to find joy in hardship, and to rise even when everything seems lost. And despite centuries of oppression, colonization, and misrepresentation, Africa's light never dimmed. It flickered at times, yes, but it never went out. It lives in the pride of its descendants scattered across the globe, in the determination of a people who carry history not as a burden, but as a crown. Africa never needed to imitate the world because it was already everything the world aspired to be: strong, wise, creative, and deeply human. Its influence runs through the veins of every civilization, even those that once denied its power. The Nile still flows as a reminder that Africa's essence cannot be erased. Its water carries the memory of empires, the laughter of children, the wisdom of ancestors, and the dreams of those yet to come. To study Africa is to study the foundation of life itself, to learn from the continent that gave humanity its first breath and its enduring spirit. The world may have tried to forget, but truth has a way of resurfacing. It comes back in the way people rediscover their roots, in the pride of Black excellence, in the revival of African art, language, and thought. The Nile whispers it, the wind sings it, and the soil remembers it. Africa has always been the beginning, and when the world finally learns to listen again, it will understand that imitation was never the goal. It was Africa's gift to the world was not just knowledge but the courage to know oneself. Because when you know who you are, you no longer need to imitate anyone. You become the mirror through which others see what's possible. Africa has always been that mirror, reflecting back to the world the truth of its own potential, and through that reflection, humanity remembers where it truly began.